In this video, we're really going to focus on the compelling questions and the supporting questions that make up a lesson plan or a unit plan. And we're going to take the actual summative performance task that I built in the last video, and we're going to use that to figure out exactly how we could change an existing supporting question in order to make it better. Alright, so before we jump into designing our curriculum even further, I wanted to take a moment to actually define and explain what compelling questions are and even show you a few examples. So we can see we're back here in the C3 framework in Dimension 1, developing questions and planning inquiries. If we scroll down, it's actually a pretty brief chapter, so if you want to actually pause me and read through this, you're welcome to. There's actually some really good examples I won't cover while I'm speaking, and since it's a brief chapter, you might consider doing that. So first, compelling questions, what are they? We have a definition right here. Compelling questions focus on enduring issues and concerns. They deal with curiosities about how things work, interpretations and applications of a disciplinary concept, and unresolved issues that require students to construct arguments and response. And I really like that idea of compelling questions being focused on unresolved issues, these ideas of what could students really be talking about that there's not a simple answer to. Compelling questions should be those big how and why questions. We would want to make sure that these are the big things driving our entire curriculum or our units. That way students are engaged the entire time. Students should come into a social studies classroom and leave it not 100% sure what the right answer is, because the only reason they stated an answer is based off evidence that they had looked at in the moment or heard arguments that their peers made or the teacher made. We always want that idea of what if to be, kind of existing in our classroom. That way our students are actually engaged. And then in contrast, supporting questions is down here. We have supporting questions focus on descriptions, definitions, and processes on which there is general agreement within the social studies disciplines and require students to construct explanations that advance claims of understanding and response. So, like it says in contrast, supporting questions focus more on those simple aspects. Descriptions, definitions, that idea of what will students actually need to do in order to answer their more big question. So really, especially for the older grades, be thinking of those complicated concepts that we might deal with, for example, causality. That could be a really big one that we work with in history, something affecting, like an event affecting a future event or a person's decision affecting how things act or go. That idea of cause and effect is a really important concept that students need to have a decent understanding of. They need to know the definition and probably a few examples. So how could you scaffold that into your curriculum? Here on the right side, we have a few examples of what this might look like. For the lower elementary, we have some more examples down here too. Again, if you want to pause me, you're more than welcome to do that so you can look through them. And since it's a short chapter, pause me and feel free to read the rest of these paragraphs because it can be pretty helpful. And as we scroll down, we see we have our standards here for the end of 8th grade, end of 12th grade. Here we have end of 8th grade, explain how a question represents key ideas in the field. So in order to do that, students are going to have a fairly decent idea of what big ideas permeate the field, and the only way they're going to be able to do that is if you, the teacher, give them those, ideas. And so that might be the idea of like weaving a supporting question into a compelling question. The supporting questions really identify for students what those big ideas are, and those students then will independently connect those ideas to their own interests, their own perspective, their own analysis. If we scroll down to our next section here, constructing supporting questions, we can see example, or you can see what it looks for us to do. It says, explain points of agreement experts have about interpretations and applications of disciplinary concepts and ideas associated with the supporting question. Kind of like that last one I just said, we're really going to want to understand what concepts we're focusing on, so you're going to want to have those prepared. Really be cognizant of like what discipline you're focusing on. So if you're economics, really be thinking about like what are the big economic ideas students are going to need exposure to, and how can those ideas then, affect their big how or why question, that big compelling question. So this section of C3 is the briefest. It's only got one other section down here for a standard. We'll talk about a couple of them, but for the most part, in this next part of the video, we're really going to be focusing on creating compelling questions and a supporting question, and then also tying that into some activities that we could be doing in class. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. Alright, so now we're back at the document we left off last time, and to remind you, we left off right here where we had this color-coded summative performance task. And this is what we would like students to be able to do as, like that final test or final project that they'll be working on. And if you remember, we color-coded it based off all of the standards and all the other, like the Ochetti Second Wind Essential Understanding, the English Language Arts connection. We did all that right here, and we made those connections so we could improve that final summative task. So again, this is where we left off, doing the summative performance task. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to figure out exactly how to use that and build really good supporting questions. And in order to do that, I'm going to take us to a different table. All right, so now we're at our new table right here, as you can see by the title, Assessment Alignment, Applying and Assessing Disciplinary Concepts and Skills. And that's actually the title of our upcoming video and really is going to be the main focus point. And I put all this into this box. I wanted to show everyone what it'll look like in the final form. Now, we won't really get into a lot of this until video 4, but just so you know, what it's going to look like. And if you're curious as to where you can find this information, you should have a Google Doc or a Microsoft or PDF available along with these videos. However, if you can't find it, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to send you a copy. And similar to last time, we don't really have the time, unfortunately, to go through every single one. So I'm really going to focus on this very top row. And if you're curious like what these 3 things represent, this is our performance task. This is our warm-up or getting ready for students to get into that performance task. And this is our supporting question. In fact, I'll go ahead and go back to the lesson plan to show you where those exactly are. All right, so we're back in our lesson plan. Remember, we always have the standards up top. And if we scroll down, we see this part 1, part 2, part 3. That's what I showed you earlier. That's why there were 3 color-coded rows, not columns. I always mess that up. These are columns. And this is the staging the supporting question. That's the supporting question. And down here, we have the formative performance task. We have these 3 things. And these really represent what I would consider a single day of work. And just to remind you, you don't need to do this, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It could be more spread out because sometimes you want to have days where students are doing things like vocabulary practice, or maybe you have some kind of interdisciplinary work with another teacher you would like to do. Maybe you just want them to read for 50 minutes. I don't know. But don't see this as something you have to do consecutively. But at the same time, it should be done fairly close with each other. So I would say within the first week or 2, you would do these things together. All right, so let's go ahead and head back to our example, and we're going to figure out how we can use the standards, the C3 framework, and the Ochetti Second Wind Essential Understandings in order to improve our questions and a little bit of our other assessment tasks. All right, so we're now back at our assessment alignment, applying and assessing disciplinary concepts and skills table. And one more time, this top row is part 1, this is part 2 here in green, and in red we have part 3. And over here to the right is our summative performance task that we created in the last video. Now again, I don't have time to go through all 3 of these, so what I did is I'm going to scroll up and show you. I created this chart, which represents this part 1. So right here in faded yellow, we have the original part 1. So if we scroll down, you'll actually see that this is a little bit different because this represents the new version. And kind of like last time, I could have sat here and worked for hours and showed you, but I thought that might be kind of a boring video, so I want to give you like the Sparks Notes version. But really, it's meant just to be a way for me to model and explain how my process works, and just to give you a few tips and tricks on how to do it. However, you will have this full access, and so even though I won't really have time to go through the green and the red sections, you'll have that available to you, and if you're curious as to how I approach those, you're always more than welcome to reach out to me over email. All right, so let's go ahead and head back to our chart right here. We're going to focus on that part 1, and we're going to align our questions with assessment. So here we have our final summative performance task that we edited, and you might see a few things that change because I make these videos throughout these days, and sometimes I see a word that I want to change. So hopefully that doesn't bug you too much. And again, if you ever are curious as to why I did something and I don't share it in this video, please ask me over email. So we have this. And just like last time, the best way I find to do things is I want to start bolding some information. So organize and use multiple pieces of evidence. I think that should be bolded because it's telling me the verb that the student should be doing. And it's also telling me a little bit about like what are students actually doing with that verb. So they're organizing pieces of evidence, for example. Again, I think that idea of from your previous lessons is interesting, but that's what we're automatically doing, so I don't think I need to bold that. We have here over the treatment of the Ochetti-Sakowin. Let's go ahead and bold that again. And really, I'm just kind of doing the same thing I did last time. It says after the Civil War. So that tells me that there is a topic. I'm going to scroll back down again. So remember, this is part 1, part 2, part 3. There's a topic in here that should cover the Ochetti-Sakowin people. So if you came across a lesson plan and it didn't, that is a change you'd want to make. And we do that because in South Dakota, we should talk about the Ochetti-Sakowin. That's the group of people that we have in South Dakota and in our surrounding states. If you were in Arizona, you might want to talk about a different indigenous group. Let's go ahead and go back. Scrolling back up, let's continue bolding. So we have, see, Ochetti-Sakowin in South Dakota after the Civil War. We have other indigenous peoples in Australia and Guatemala. To remind you, this lesson plan was originally designed to be a global citizenship lesson plan, so that's why we have Australia and Guatemala. You could change it if you wanted to, but I like it, so I'm not going to. We have here to develop, we have another verb, a coherent argument. So that's going to help us figure out what we should write. And then we have our compelling question again. How can the renaming of people, places, and events around the world demonstrate the marginalization? That word I think is really big and important and something that maybe 8th graders or even high school students might struggle with. And we did already bold Ochetti-Sakowin, so I think we're good down here. So here we are. Again, this is my general process where I bold this information to help me figure out exactly what I'm doing. And I take these bolded words now and I start looking backwards, again, that idea of backward design, and I start figuring out exactly what I want my students to be doing the days prior before the summative assessment in order to prepare for it. All right, so now that we have done that bolding of the summative performance task words, we can start looking back and we see here we have performance task, we have our staging the compelling question, or the supporting question, I should say, and then we have our supporting question. Now, normally we would start with the compelling question, so we want to figure out what big overarching inquiry are our students doing. However, it's already built into the summative performance task, which you don't always have to do that. I don't know, I probably do it 50-50, where sometimes I directly quote the big question, and sometimes I think it's not necessary, so I don't. Here, we've already actually done some editing. Remember, we added the word resilience because of our Ochetti-Sakowin standard. So I think we already did a pretty good job of doing this. That random 2 has appeared again. I'll explain the 2. I use something called hotkeys to start my videos. And so if you ever see like a random 1 or a 2 in the curriculum, it's because that's what I use to start and stop the recording. So that is why. All right, so that's the explanation for the random 2s and 1s. Now, we have our summative performance task, and we can start looking backwards now at our performance task, our staging the supporting question, and here the supporting question. And I think some people would argue you should start with the formative performance task and work your way back. I kind of do the same thing with my standards, right? I have the same philosophy when I'm using my standards. I don't start from any particular point. I think you should go wherever your eyes catch first. And so we have bolded words, and since this video focuses on supporting question, I'll start with this one, but you don't have to. So, we have, why were many Native American children given English names? That's a fine supporting question. I think it'll work well, especially if you have students who are from areas where, you know, we have, like when I taught in Pierce, South Dakota, we had plenty of students who had their indigenous name, but they also had an English name or French name. It's a good, relevant topic for many South Dakota students and citizens. However, I don't necessarily think it really connects well with what we're doing here. We want to talk about marginalization. I'm going to widen that a little bit because I want that N to be right there. There we go. So we're talking about marginalization, which is why I actually changed the question to focus on what does resilience and marginalization mean. So I got that straight from the bolded words. And remember, we want students to be able to answer this question. And maybe you could argue that, yeah, if students were doing this, first one, maybe they could make those connections. But I think if we really consider the cognitive development of our young people, of our teenagers, you know, they really have a hard time making those connections. And honestly, I think they're going to need the definitions of resilience and marginalization. So I'll go ahead and bold those 2 words right there. And by doing that, I think all that we have done then is actually help students figure out, like, oh, wow, we can actually now define these things. And if you look at the staging the supporting question, we're even going to make a T-chart in which the students will actually talk about, how that marginalization or representation or resistance, what I wrote, works in their own personal lives. I asked them to use sensory words that characterize resistance. And if you don't remember, that comes straight from our English language arts connection. And then, again, I think that's going to be a much better way of preparing them for this support or this summative performance task, because now all of a sudden they have to actually define resilience and marginalization. They're going to collect information to do it. And you can see down here I put as product a T-chart. And I wrote product because that is the entire idea behind this lesson. Is they're going to be producing, organizing, which we have right here, right? The notes in order to take into their final summative assessment. That's going to help them be a lot more prepared for their summative assessment, but it's also going to help them actually care about this stuff. It's basically daily work. And so that's the basics of what you do. You actually just look at the bolded words, you ask yourself, are these questions, these supporting questions, actually supporting the summative performance task? And what we're going to cover in the next video is we're really going to look at how do we stage the supporting question, how do we create a formative performance task that actually produces something that the students can either use to study, like a study guide, or a component of a project, or in this case, notes that they can take into their test. And to remind you, if we scroll down, we'll see that I did this again. I changed each question. And I'm going to include all this in a document where you can see how I changed things, and you're always more than welcome to ask me exactly how we did things, but unfortunately we only ever have time to do like one of them, so we'll talk more about it at the workshop if you'd like to. Alright, so that concludes how we do our supporting questions, and a little bit of our compelling question too, but our compelling question was already fairly solid, so we didn't really need to worry about it so much. Now remember, bring materials to these workshops, because if you do, we can actually look at compelling and supporting questions that you have and edit them. Or I could actually even get into how can we create compelling and supporting questions from scratch. There are a lot of great methods that actually use our students' interests, the things that they care about. We can actually use that information to create really stellar questions. And thank you for stopping in, for watching these videos. Please send me any emails that you like, or email Melinda Johnson. She is our wonderful specialist here at the South Dakota Department of Education. Until the next video, take care.